Bad news is we're running short of time. The good news is that my comments on Doug's paper are mercifully short. I'm going to give you a different target to aim at, so deflect any criticisms of Doug by focusing on me. So I want to talk about Husak's courses of conduct and the Susan case. So Doug Husak wants us to problematize the act-omission distinction. He attempts to do so by giving us the example of Susan, who while driving sees Megan crossing the street, but who rather than braking, steering to avoid Megan or taking some other evasive action, instead remains motionless and allows her car to continue in the direction she was heading, which results in her car hitting and killing Megan. When prosecuted for vehicular homicide, Susan claims the killing resulted from an omission, not an act, and that none of the bases for omission liability, the breaching of a duty to act, apply to her. Now, Husak agrees with Susan's latter contention, namely that none of the bases of omission liability, none of the standard bases, are present in Susan's case. The obvious bases among the traditional ones is Husak's D, creation of the peril. But Husak thinks D is not applicable, for he says, Susan did not place Megan in the road, and until her omission is driving legally and reasonably. However, I think Husak is wrong here. Susan did create the peril, and thereby acquired a duty to act to avoid it. One need not throw out the act-omission distinction and introduce courses of conduct to decide Susan's case or the many cases like Susan's in the intuitively correct way. But before I deal explicitly with Susan's case, let me illustrate what I think is the correct approach to it by analogy with voluntary act problems. Doug adverts to voluntary act problems, and I'm going to take those up. Take the notorious Mr. DeCina. When he has his fateful epileptic seizure while driving, he is no longer acting voluntarily. But is this a problem for finding him criminally liable? Of course not. For driving without having taken one's anti-seizure medication is a voluntary act, and the involuntary actions that followed were its product. DeCina was culpable for his voluntary act, not for the involuntary actions that it produced, except by way of the causal linkage. Or consider, now we'll go to fictitious, consider Dr. Pepper, who has epileptic seizures at precisely 10, 2, and 4 each day. His plan is to kill his passenger. In Dr. Pepper's car, there's only a driver's side airbag. So Dr. Pepper takes to the crowded highway with his passenger, drives at highway speed, and continues to 10 a.m., at which time he has the seizure he predicted, blacks out, and crashes. He is saved by the airbag. The passenger is killed, as Dr. Pepper intended and just as he planned. Dr. Pepper is guilty of murder, despite having been unconscious when his car went out of control and crashed. His voluntary act of driving with the passenger at 10 a.m., knowing that he was due for a seizure then, was the culpable act. The same thing would be true of Debbie, who wants to kill her shipboard cabin mate, Vera, by stabbing her. Debbie is, however, unsure if she can bring herself to voluntarily plunge a knife into Vera. So Debbie concocts a plan in which, when the ship gets to rough water and begins pitching violently, she will stand across the cabin from Vera holding a knife in front of her and wait for the pitching of the ship to hurl her involuntarily across the cabin and into Vera. If she kills Vera as planned, surely Debbie cannot escape justice by claiming her stabbing was an involuntary act caused by the pitching of the ship. It was that, but it was incorporated into a plan that was initiated by the voluntary act of positioning herself and the knife in a certain way. That voluntary act is the basis of Debbie's guilt. So now let me return to Susan and her omission. Susan had a duty to act because she created Megan's peril. She did so, as do all drivers, by driving, including driving legally and reasonably. Driving imperils anyone who will be harmed by the car unless the driver steers clear of them, as Susan did not. There are indeed many everyday acts that imperil others if the actor then omits to act to avert the peril. Suppose John is teaching a toddler to swim. He puts the toddler in the pool, an act. That act places the toddler in peril unless John acts to then support the toddler in the water. His omitting to do so would be culpable because by virtue of having put the toddler in the water, he has put the toddler in peril and acquired a duty to rescue the toddler. Similarly, one who lights a fuse that will, if the flame is not stanched, lead to a house's burning down, acquires a duty to act, not omit, to stanch the flame. The examples of such acts that create peril are numerous and commonplace, and Susan's driving is such an act. Just as we do not need any fancy footwork to get around the voluntary act requirement in Decina, we do not need to introduce courses of conduct and problematize the act omission distinction to handle Susan's case or any other. Let me just say, that's the end of my sort of direct remarks. The imperiling basis of duties to act, that particular one, which is the one that was prevalent in Susan's case, is unproblematic in cases like Susan or John, who's teaching the toddler to swim, or any of those others. It is notoriously difficult in cases where one imperils others, not in the physical way that driving or throwing someone in the water imperils, but in other ways that one might imperil someone, such as when one realizes that the person is relying upon you to save them from some peril, even though you did not intend to create the reliance, but you know you are. So I'll just leave you with one to think about. This is one of several that I use, but this one is Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, is doing his daily training. He swims out to a buoy in the ocean, swims back. That's his training method. As he's swimming to the buoy, he sees someone in his course, in his path, or just barely to the side of his path, who is obviously flailing, drowning, is in peril. At the same time, he hears cheers back on the beach. The people on the beach who can see the person is drowning and can see that Michael Phelps is heading there, those persons, including the lifeguards, are assuming that Michael Phelps is going to rescue this person, as he obviously can easily do. Michael Phelps has no intention to rescue, but he knows that as he swims, he's creating this impression that he is rescuing, and that at the point at which he swims past them and the lifeguards realize that there was no rescue afoot, it will be too late to rescue. Now, those are cases of imperiling that I find particularly intriguing, but the physical kinds, where Susan is driving the car and creates duties to act to avoid in all sorts of ways the people that she is imperiling, I do not find problematic. But I give you a different target. Thank you.
Well, thanks. This could go very quickly. Larry was good enough to give me his comments ahead of time, which I very much appreciate. So, as I understand him, he believes that Susan harmed Megan by an omission, and that's why he needs to find one of the limited bases on which to blame Susan for her omission, which is where he resorts to option D, which is the creation of a peril. Now, I'm inclined to disagree that Susan harmed Megan by an omission in the first place, But I confess I'm just not absolutely sure myself how to conceptualize this everyday case, so it's a little more puzzling to me than I gather it is to Larry, but I suspect that Larry is himself a little more ambivalent about his analysis than he lets on. After all, he explicitly says that Susan's driving is an act. So did Susan kill Megan while she was driving or not? If she did, then Susan killed Megan by, when, and while she was acting. And we've got no need to find a basis for her to be liable for an omission, which is, of course, what Clause D does. So I guess that Alexander believes that Susan did not kill Megan while she was performing the act of driving, but rather while she was omitting to drive or not driving. That's why he analyzes the case somewhat like Decina. Now, that just seems strange to me. I mean, I would bet, and we'll have to see what people in the room think, I'll bet that the folk would say, speakers of English would say that Susan hit Megan while she was driving. So, what, does each of us stop driving every instant we're motionless and then begin to drive again over and over? Is that what Alexander is leading us to believe? So if we hit pedestrians while motionless, and thus when we're omitting, do we need to go back to find a previous act that creates the duty not to harm, which is the act of driving that creates the peril? Now maybe I've misunderstood the analysis that Alexander's giving us, but my own tentative position is that Susan killed Megan while and by driving. So what killed Susan was driving, and driving consists in a course of conduct, and a course of conduct is not quite analyzable as either an act or an omission, but rather as something a bit different. But let's see what you think.
Hi, Doug. Kim Ferzan. So I just see this as a concurrence problem. So, I mean, you've just picked sort of a puzzling concurrence issue, right? So you have an act that causes harm. But the problem is at T1, when the act that she's engaging in would cause harm, she lacks the mens rea. And at T2, she forms the mens rea, and she would have to then engage in an action that would prevent the harm, and it looks like an omission. So I don't see it like Decina. I just see it as one of these puzzles of how do we connect the fact that we have the action at T1 to the mental state at T2. And I'm sympathetic either to calling it creation of peril or to saying the sort of continuing act doctrine works in those cases. I don't quite understand why Simister and Sullivan's solution doesn't work for you. You have an obligation not to cause harm. Yeah, that's your duty. And because of that, we don't need a further additional duty that Susan owes to the pedestrian, like that's her daughter or something like that. The very engaging in the act is the thing that grounds the fact that she ought to turn the car at T2.
So you want to... Yeah, sure.
Find a mic.
I'm not going to have an answer to every conceptualization. I'm actually personally most interested in hearing the alternatives that people want to defend. And so you, Kim, are conceptualizing this as an omission, right?
Or an omission embedded within a continuing act.
Okay, well that's of course, if in fact you call this a continuing act, then there's no need to find a separate rationale like creating the peril, right? Because those are conditions under which you hold people liable for omissions. If this isn't an omission, then that list becomes irrelevant to the question. Now you'll need maybe a separate list of when people become liable for harming during a course of conduct, but it's not no reason to think it's going to be identical to this list. So it looks to me like you want to have it both ways, which I think is what I accuse Larry of doing as well, but I'm not sure. Is it or is it not? Yeah, okay.
You and I I can fight at dinner all night, so they're alone.
Okay, number 17, please.
Doug, I thought the idea of course of conduct is really interesting. I was puzzled by some of the things you said about omission. I thought, at some point you said if you're omitting, then you're motionless, and that seems, it seems, so, suppose there's something I'm supposed to do at T, and then I omit to do it at T, but it seems I could be doing anything and still be omitting to do that at T. I'm not sure where the motionless idea would come from. And so, the way this is connected is, Susan could be driving at T and omitting to turn at T, and she could be driving and omitting to turn the steering wheel.
So driving is an act, and at the time she's acting, she's also omitting to turn the steering wheel.
Right, so the
Okay.
omitting is just, she's not turning the steering wheel. And you can,
That's an omission.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, so you could be driving and performing that act
Uh-huh.
and not performing another one. If
So,
you're supposed to perform the other one, then you
at-
omit
so
it.
at the very same time, she's both acting and omitting,
Yeah,
right?
right, I don't see why not.
Oh,
Yeah.
maybe. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to this that I'm incredibly confident in. And so here is yet another answer that, in fact, she is both acting and omitting. Of course, I think, in a way, not so far from my answer, courses of conduct, when you go very fine-grained, consists of acts and omissions. So maybe our answers aren't very different?
No,
Okay.
that can happen.
So when someone is both acting and omitting, as in Susan's case, you're happy with calling that a course of conduct? Okay? I can live with that.
Number 8, please.
So this is going to continue Kim's line of inquiry, and it's really, I suppose, the same point. It seems to me that when you don't stop driving, you drive into one. When you don't stop strangling somebody, you're strangling them. When you don't take the knee off their throat, you're strangling them. When you don't stop delivering the poison to them, you're poisoning them. The criminal law says don't kill, right? This constitutes a set of willed bodily movements that in fact approximately result in a death. So the rule isn't turn, don't turn. The rule is don't kill. And so long as there's contracted willed bodily movements resulting approximately in the driving into somebody of a vehicle, you've got a active killing. And so I just don't, I don't see the problem here. You want to call it an embedded omission, you can call it an embedded omission. I would call it actively driving into somebody and thereby, in fact, approximately killing them. And so I just don't get the puzzle here. If you ever persuaded me that there were no willed bodily movements involved in holding down the accelerator and holding fast to the steering wheel, then I would have to repair to Larry's solution and say, well, you've got an instance in which you've created peril and now you have to actively and affirmatively avert it. But in these kinds of cases, you've got precisely the kind of willed bodily movements and causal proximacy that results in the causally complex state of affairs that the criminal law prohibits.
So this is just an act of driving, pure and simple. There were moments, including the time of impact, when Susan didn't move her body, but so what, right? It's still driving, and the act of driving includes motions and lack of motions, and that's just what driving consists in, right? So that's not unlike what I wanted to call a course of conduct. I'm not sure we disagree.
We don't disagree except for the result, except for the conclusion, which is, in my view, it's not an omission, it's an action, right?
Might
I've
be an
actively
omission.
killed, and in your view, you think we've got a puzzle here. I don't think we have any puzzle here.
Well, maybe not. Maybe there is no puzzle. In fact, one of the ways to resolve this possible puzzle is to say, what's the puzzle? I don't see the puzzle. Larry, I think, sees a puzzle, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Larry sees an omission as being what Susan's conduct consists in at the moment of impact, and therefore, as in DeCina's case, he wants to go back to a prior moment of time to find a voluntary act that somehow caused the subsequent omission. And when that occurs, then you somehow subsume this under clause D or E, whichever it is, which is creation of a peril. That's certainly not your solution, right? Since this isn't an omission in the first place, there's just no problem here of omissions that we need to grapple with.
So, so here was my thought. So often we're in law where you have a laundry list of conditions which would be sufficient for meeting a particular condition on which differences in legal treatment are predicated. What that indicates is that you've got some fuzzy boundaried concept, or at least, or hard to adjudicate concept. And then you're giving guidance to fact finders about what falls within the concept because you think that they're likely to make mistakes without such guidance. So I wonder about this instance. So this is one where, so the thought is it's extraordinarily intrusive for the government to demand conduct of you all the time in cases in which failure to engage in such conduct is going to cause harm. So we want some sort of limit on when it's intrusive, when it's too intrusive. And so the thought is it's too intrusive when they demand that you do things that you don't have a legal duty to do. So now there's this question, well, what's that legal duty thing? It's where you want to draw the boundaries of that is a matter of what's too intrusive or not too intrusive for the government to demand of you. Now it's very difficult to adjudicate that, what's too intrusive of the government. So you list a series of things. It's too intrusive. It's not too intrusive if you've got a special status relationship. It's not too intrusive if all these things, right? Now, your case, it looks to me like one where, of course, there is a duty. The problem is that we don't have in law anything which is specifying the boundary of the concept that under which it falls properly. And so people want to jump through hoops to make it fall under that concept. But so now often what happens is, of course, what you in fact happen in this case, which is that where you find an instance in which where everybody can see that it falls under this rather fuzzy boundary concept, but not because it meets one of the law's special conditions used to help people to adjudicate. Fact finders just kind of pretend like it falls under the concept and they move forward as if that was the case. And so they convict here and they would say, because obviously she had a duty to swerve, right? So I feel like, in a sense, so that is the problem in a sense is that it's not that that the argument is unsound quite. It's rather that number 3 here isn't really identifying the full set of duties. So I guess maybe the argument is unsound for this reason. Number 3 is not actually identifying the full set of duties. There are actually other duties. Now we don't recognize them specifically in law because we're trying to cabin the way people adjudicate the question of whether or not you have a duty, because that would require handing over a problem that's very difficult to solve about when government is too intrusive.
So I take it that if you're going to supplement 3 and find more conditions, it must be because you think that what Susan did was an omission. Otherwise, you don't need more conditions because the conditions impose liability for omissions, or when your act includes an omission, or your conduct is somehow based on an omission, or whatever those relations mean. So you must think that there's something that her conduct in some way consists in an omission, therefore you're willing to amend 3.
Well, yeah, so I mean, I actually think there's multiple things here. I think that she's engaging in both omissions and actions, and it could be that some of them it could be multiple grounds on which we could impose criminal liability on her.
Multiple grounds.
Multiple, you know, maybe on the theory that Kim offered and that Heidi elaborated, maybe on, I don't know. But here's one of them. She omitted to swerve. Okay? That's something she omitted. There's other acts too, and maybe those bear the causal role, yada, yada. But she omitted to swerve. And I think that that's going to turn out to be sufficient for criminal liability. The reason is that she had a duty to swerve. And you say, well, wait, these are the duties. And I say, no, it's not too intrusive for the government to demand that she swerve. And that's the sense in which she has a legal duty to swerve. Now, do we give it over to fact finders to decide whether or not it's too intrusive of the government to demand that? Well, no, we don't generally. Because what we do is we require fact finders to cabin duty, to put it into one of these 5 categories. And this one doesn't fall under those 5 categories. That doesn't mean there isn't a duty here.
And this is a resolution that you think is one that conforms to law? That is, oh, well, it looks like this is the law. But
Well-
never mind that. What we really want the law to be is implicit ways of getting Susan when we can't figure out how to do so by law, because common sense, we all agree she should be liable. And so never mind what the law says, we're going to hold her liable by imagining there is some other residual clause that applies here, something like you've got a duty to swerve when everybody would think you had such a duty, and it's not so onerous for the government to demand that, something like that.
Yeah, so when you say what is the law, I think that turns out to be quite difficult in these areas. So, so take for instance a statute that I know you know, the Model Penal Code statute, listing all the different ways in which you can have a behavior which is strongly corroborative of an intention and thus satisfy the act requirement for an attempt, right? Now, it's not, of course, the implication is that you could have other ones that weren't on the list. And that's what law allows, is that there can be others that aren't on the list. But the list is extraordinarily useful for adjudication purposes. And I would say something similar about this list of the duties. So
Well,
the law is
I'm-
bigger than, the law is more
yeah.
than what the statutes say.
I'm starting to feel a little vindicated, and I've heard different answers, I think, to what is, this is an everyday occurrence. This is not one of the wild philosophical hypotheticals we're famous for involving vaporizing ray guns that disintegrate fat men in caves and things. This is an everyday sort of situation. And, it's interesting just how difficult it is to conceptualize everyday cases in the terms that we're here to discuss. So maybe your answer is right. I mean, I'm not quite in the business of saying, well, that's clearly wrong. What's most interesting to me is the variety of possible answers people defend to reach the result that we all agree is the right answer.
That would be me. Okay, so I've been here for 14 years and I've known Larry during this time. I'll say something that I've never said to Larry. I agree with you. But let's see if we can get a little bit clearer on this. So Larry gives us a bunch of examples. There are other examples that involve things like, if you drop a very large object and it's falling, right, you've created a risk for the people who are underneath. It seems like you now have an affirmative obligation to avoid the risk. If you have a net and you can put it under and save those people, then you should do it. What you need to do is, instead of thinking of this kind of case as one of driving, it's a very ordinary language way of looking at it, you need to break down the driving into the various subcomponent activities and non-activities that are going on. What's actually happened is that Susan set the car in motion. She set the car in motion, and once she set the car in motion, it becomes dangerous. Before that, it didn't become dangerous. There was no peril. That puts her in a position of being obligated to avoid, hitting people under the circumstances. Now, so I think that falls under Larry's, D, and there's no puzzle. I don't think there's any puzzle here. The puzzle solved. But there are puzzles, and Gideon is getting at it, I think. So let me just make this clear. Imagine that instead of Susan driving, Voldemort just plonked Susan in the car, right? And there's no way of controlling the car except for turning the wheel, right? And the car is otherwise out of control. It's a runaway trolley, but she has option. She can either do nothing or she can turn the wheel. Okay, now does she have an obligation to turn the wheel, I would have said, well, clearly she has a moral obligation to turn the wheel under the circumstances. Does it fall under one of the exceptions? Is it one of, no, right? It's not one of A through E, but does that mean that she doesn't have a legal duty? I would have thought she does have a legal duty under the circumstances. But so then you've got another, got an exceptional case. Same kind of situation, of course, with Singer's drowning child example, right? You've got, there's the kid that's drowning. You walk by, you omit to save the child. It seems to me, not just morally, but I would have hoped anyway, legally liable. No, I know you're not, but you should be.
Right. So if I understood you, you were giving two different answers. On one answer, Larry is right. Susan is omitting. Therefore, we need to find on a list that's either complete or incomplete, we can supplement the list if we need to, some condition that would make Susan liable for the harm that she has caused, if cause is the right word. I think it is. So we then need to find some condition, and the condition Larry finds and you rather sympathize with is creating a peril. And we know driving is dangerous. I mean, driving is the most dangerous thing that probably everyone in this room does. And so you want to go from engaged in a dangerous activity to creating any peril that dangerous activity creates, something like that. And I think that's a pretty fast slide. I mean, I agree that driving is dangerous. I'm not sure why it follows that any time you are doing a dangerous thing like driving, I don't want weird cases here, but the kinds of things that happen, like when Susan winds up hitting Megan, that's the creation of a peril. I mean, I just wouldn't have thought myself until Larry defended this answer and others came up with this answer, I wouldn't have thought that this is the creation of a peril. Now, I mean, I speak English. When is a peril created? Not just by engaged in a dangerous activity like driving. I mean, again, I hate to do what so many other people do and what students do all the time, which is change the example. But if Megan had been driving too, would that have made a difference? I mean, if Megan had been in a car, and so she's driving also, well, then they're both creating a mutual peril. But if it's Susan who could swerve and she sees that and doesn't, would that make a difference? I, again, don't want to change the hypothetical too much, but I'm just not sure that it seems clear to me, and most of the illustrations I see in textbooks of creating a peril aren't like this. There are cases in which you culpably or non-culpably cause the very person to be in the situation they're in. That's clearly not what's going on here. At any rate, then you found a different solution which is incompatible with the first, right? That is, according to
for a different case.
I'm sorry?
For a different case.
For a different case. So this case, you think there's an omission, and so we need to find some basis for holding people liable for an omission, and either it's Larry's solution, that's what you are inclined to do, but you're sympathetic to the possibility, as Gideon said, that maybe the list is not complete.
That's right.
I would think this is a case of driving. And driving, I mean, that seems to me, I also wonder if you had non-philosophers, non-lawyers, I'm not sure why we should privilege the folk here. I think they'd be astounded to hear that there's some controversy. I wonder what they'd think, actually. I think they'd think, well, this is a case of driving. And who cares whether at the moment, of course, when you drive, you do things and you don't do things. So what? A lot of things are like that. Maybe I'm wrong about what people would think, or whether it matters.
Holly Smith, this is perhaps beating a dead horse at this point, but I had much the same instincts about this. It seems to me there's a detail of this case which you haven't referred to, at least in your presentation of it, which is that there are really two things going on here. She's pressing the pedal. She's not merely resting her foot on the pedal initially, but she's pressing the pedal, and she's also holding the wheel steady. So then you can think of sort of what happens through time. At T1, she sees Megan. She could have avoided Megan's death either by taking her foot off the pedal or by swerving. She doesn't do either one. At T2, the momentum of the car is such that even if she took her foot off the pedal, the car would run into Megan if she doesn't do anything else. But she could avoid that by swerving. Again, she doesn't do either. But at that point, the fact that she hasn't taken her foot off the pedal seems to me she is creating a peril now, and she has a duty to prevent that peril from materializing by swerving, but she doesn't do either. Then at T3, immediately before the impact, it's too late for her to avoid the death, either by taking her foot off the pedal because of the momentum of the car, or by swerving because she's too close. She actually does both, but it's too late, and so she kills Megan and hits her. So I'd be inclined to say she creates a peril here, and she also omits to prevent the peril from actualizing in the death. I don't know whether we want to think of this as an omission or not. I'm not sure how to categorize it, but that's kind of how I would think about it.
I don't want to beat a dead horse. I don't want to be the dead horse that's beaten. I wonder, I also, I just wonder, I would love to know what the people who have said little about this, I almost like to see a show of hands, how many, maybe that's unfair, but I don't want to put people on the spot, but I just wonder how many people tend to think something like what Larry said, or extremely close to what Larry said, there's no mission, and it's the creation of a peril, therefore bringing Susan under an acceptive clause that is familiar in law, and that's how we get liability. That's the view, right?
Well, I just wanted to state, part of what I said was based on a picture of what was going on here, which may not be true. So
Mhm.
well, if your foot was still on the pedal, if your hands were actively grasping the steering wheel and holding it steady, then it's just an act. So I was assuming more something like you started the car, it's going a certain thing, you then take your foot off the gas, you take your hands off the wheel, and this is the point at which you form the mens rea. So you don't have any mens rea while you have your foot on the gas, but you now are just, it's as if you started the runaway trolley, it gets going, and now you can steer it to avoid, but you don't.
I had in mind, good, and I think it's always good to get more detail about these cases. So much depends on details, perhaps. I had in mind that she sees Megan, remains motionless, that is, let's say, let's go with the wheel altogether. How's that?
Yeah, that would help.
Uh-huh.
And takes her foot off the gas.
Okay, so let's suppose she does that. Does that change? After she forms the mens rea, she sees, does that matter? Okay, that matters too. I see, okay. So whether she takes her foot, hands off the wheel before or after she forms the mens rea makes a difference here. Now, of course, if in fact you conceptualize this as a course of conduct that's ongoing, then those fine-grained questions of exactly at what time she formed the mens rea may not matter much, because it's an act of driving, and during the act of driving, she had the mens rea to kill, and she did, or the mens rea to hit, and seriously bodily injure or whatever. So there aren't concurrence problems because there aren't two things to which you want any concurrence. There aren't separate acts, one of which involves mens rea and one of which doesn't, or one omission which doesn't involve mens rea when the act does not. So it seems like concurrence problems don't arise under a course of conduct solution.
So what if she wants to test whether her steering is pulling to the side or not? So she wants to test whether her steering is pulling to the side. So she takes her hands off and she takes her foot off. Then she notices Megan. And then the question is, what does she do?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, she's going to have the mens rea at the right time, and that's the reason we've got concurrence problems.
But we're all going to agree that if that's the situation, then it's an omission.
We are.
If you want the straw poll,
Uh-huh.
you
Uh-huh.
can have it.
Uh-huh.
You're not going to agree with that? Okay.
Okay, I think it's time for us to thank the speaker and the commentator.